The date was December 20th, 1944. The time, 0300 hours. The location? A frozen, unnamed logging trail slicing through the dense, unforgiving woods near the village of Neuville, just north of Bastogne, Belgium. The Ardennes forest, blanketed by a heavy, insulating layer of fresh snow, was a study in cold, silent dread. Every breath plumed into the frigid air, a visible, momentary ghost. The silence, when it came, was not peace, but a tightening tourniquet of anticipation, broken only by the sporadic, high-pitched thud of artillery miles away. This silence meant only one thing. The enemy was moving, maneuvering, closing the trap. Deep within a half-track sat Captain Elias Vance, A4 logistics officer of the Provisional 2nd Task Force. Vance wasn't a man built for the sharp-edged chaos of the front, but for the quiet, methodical precision of the ledger. Now his battlefield was a sheet of ice, and his enemy was the clock. The crisis was acute, brutal, and immediate. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment and elements of Combat Command B had been driven back onto a critical crossroads. They were not merely surrounded, they were compressed, their fighting perimeter shrinking by the hour as Panzer Lehr and the 2nd SS Panzer Division applied relentless, professional pressure. The American units were exhausted, critically outnumbered, and, most terrifyingly, running out of the very things that defined them as a fighting force. Vance's manifest was a scroll of desperation: 40,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, 120 gallons of high-octane gasoline, 30 pints of Rh-negative plasma. Without these specific supplies, the forward units, designated Iron Fist, would not merely be forced to withdraw, they would be annihilated. Their radios were transmitting reports in clipped, desperate bursts. The final reserve of white phosphorus is on station. We have less than 90 minutes of sustained fire remaining. Vance gripped the handset. He had already petitioned for an emergency ground convoy. The reply from General Staff Headquarters, crackling and distorted through the static, was a firm, cold command that chained his hands. Negative on all ground movement, Task Force A4. I repeat, negative. The current directive is Operation Weathervane Readiness only. Maintain perimeter doctrine. Do not attempt a ground run until the MSR is fully secured by 1st Army armor and aerial resupply is confirmed. Protocol must be maintained to minimize asset exposure. Repeat, protocol must be maintained. That is a direct order, Captain. Vance was ordered to stand down, to wait for a miracle of weather or a breakthrough that might not come for days. He was told to respect the protocol of asset preservation while men died mere miles away for lack of plasma and ammunition. His eyes drifted from the radio to a hastily assembled list, the morning's prisoner of war labor manifest. These men, captured from Luftwaffe ground units and exhausted infantry divisions, were housed 3 miles back, assigned strictly to non-combat, rear-echelon tasks. Vance had no armored escort, no dedicated combat drivers, and no heavy haulage assets capable of moving the 10-ton load over the iced-over back trails he had charted. But he did have 250 men of the Wehrmacht. Their use in a forward-area combat-adjacent supply run was explicitly forbidden by the Standing Army Field Manual. It was against protocol because it risked violating the Geneva Convention's rules against exposing POWs to danger. To motivate them to do such a suicidal, high-risk run, Vance would have to violate a second rule: unauthorized, advanced incentive pay drawn from a secret, discretionary scrip fund. He would be using the ultimate forbidden tactic, trading American lives for enemy compliance, bought with money the enemy was not even due. Vance removed his gloves, letting the icy air bite his fingers. He folded the headquarters directive and tucked it into his jacket pocket, a physical symbol of the rule he was about to break. He stood and looked out at the silent, unforgiving forest, not as a logistics officer, but as a man who understood that every great strategic victory is, at its heart, a calculated violation of a rule. He walked toward the radio tent, not to receive an order, but to issue one. The clock had 2 hours to run on the lives of 4,000 men. Captain Elias Vance made a quiet, definitive decision that only a man who understood numbers could make. The arithmetic of lives outweighed the arithmetic of regulations. He was going to pay the enemy to save his men, and he was going to do it now. To understand the audacious, almost unthinkable gamble Captain Elias Vance was about to take, we must first understand the man. Vance was not cut from the usual heroic cloth of the war. He was not a paratrooper or an infantryman. He was, to use the blunt terminology of the Army, non-essential personnel in terms of frontline combat. But in the grand calculus of war, he was indispensable. Before Pearl Harbor had ripped America from its comfortable peacetime, Elias Vance was the chief operations manager for the Consolidated Overland Trucking Authority, responsible for the frictionless flow of goods across 20 states. Vance had never studied military strategy. His textbooks were manifests, routing maps, and maintenance schedules. His childhood obsession, the thing that gave him his unique, almost intuitive understanding of flow and pressure, was the intricate world of model railroads. He spent his hours in his parents' basement not just assembling the train sets, but designing, building, and maintaining enormous, complex traffic flow simulations. He learned that a single predictable delay on a single track could ripple outward, seizing up an entire continental network. He learned that the solution to a crisis was never to wait for the perfect track to clear, but to identify the most unconventional, ignored piece of rolling stock and the most unthinkable shortcut and force the issue. His civilian profession had taught him a critical lesson that the Army was only now learning. Logistics is not a secondary effort. It is the ultimate, non-negotiable strategic front. Elias Vance did not see soldiers, trucks, or ammunition. He saw a resource pool, a payload mass, and a network of constrained nodes. Now, standing in the bitter cold of the Ardennes, he saw his network collapsing. And he saw one single, vast, ignored resource: the enemy. The stage for Vance's desperate gamble was the savage, ongoing catastrophe known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German objective was simple: a massive thrust to seize the vital port of Antwerp. The spearhead of this thrust was comprised of the deadliest, most professional units the Wehrmacht still possessed, including the hardened veterans of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the elite Panzer Lehr Division, equipped with formidable Panther and Tiger tanks. These were commanders who were methodical, brutal, and utterly focused on the objective. The strategic nightmare for Vance was the logistics of the terrain itself. The Ardennes was a maze of narrow, winding roads and steep wooded ridges, rendered exponentially worse by the continuous snowfall and the paralyzing ice. The only route open was a perilous, barely charted logging track, a secondary line that no logistical manual would dare recommend. To save the men at the crossroads, Vance needed not just speed, but a psychological camouflage, an act of sheer audacity that would paralyze the professional German mind. Vance was a man of the ledger, not the rifle, but he did not go alone. His team was a miniature, highly specialized logistics cell, 3 men who trusted his unconventional genius implicitly. First, there was Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a master motor pool sergeant who viewed all bureaucracy with contempt. Kowalski was the team's mechanical backbone. He viewed Vance's request with a mixture of professional dread and loyalty. "Captain, you're asking me to drive a truck full of plasma across an ice rink and use Krauts as porters. If they shoot at us, who do I shoot back with? My oil can?" Next was Private First Class Doc Miller, officially a truck driver, but unofficially a field medic. A quiet, religious man, Miller's personality was defined by a calm, absolute devotion to the sick and wounded. He wasn't concerned with the regulations, only the payload. The rhesus-negative plasma, the morphine, the blood replacement packets. "I don't care who carries the box, Captain, as long as the contents save a life," he told Vance. His presence grounded Vance's scheme. It wasn't about glory or protocol. It was about triage on a grand scale. This was the crew, the calculating manager, the cynical mechanic, and the quiet healer. They were the perfect, imperfect engine for an unauthorized mission. The strategic nightmare was now dissolving into tactical reality. The official plan, Operation Weathervane, the eventual resupply by air, was already dead, a frozen casualty of the continuous, impenetrable cloud cover that sealed the Ardennes like a tomb. The radio crackled again, more frantically this time. A4, this is Iron Fist actual. Casualties mounting, especially leg and abdominal. We are out of surgical tape and plasma is depleted. Repeat, plasma is depleted. We cannot hold the line for fire suppression for another hour. We're going to have to spike the guns and attempt a withdrawal if nothing arrives by 0500 hours. Do you copy, A4? We are at terminal capacity. The desperate, panicked words hung heavy in the cold air. Terminal capacity. The official plan had failed. Vance looked at the map. 0500 hours was barely 2 hours away. The time for protocol was over. The time for a forbidden, desperate, brilliant solution had arrived. He knew exactly how to make the enemy work harder than any American soldier had a right to ask.
Vance walked away from the radio. The static-laced fear of the battlefield momentarily replaced by the mundane realities of the POW holding area. He watched the prisoners, supervised by a bored, bundled-up American MP. The POWs were engaged in mandatory daily work stipulated by the Geneva Convention, hauling heavy timber logs for firewood and stacking tins of K rations. It was the way they moved the logs that struck Vance with the force of an epiphany. They worked with the cold, professional coordination of a well-drilled labor battalion. They handled the heavy, icy timber with a practiced economy of motion, their movements efficient, their footing sure on the treacherous ground. They were trained, they were disciplined, and they were fresh. Vance's mind, the model railway engineer's mind, didn't see German soldiers. He saw a massive, inert mass of power and discipline simply waiting for the right incentive switch to be thrown. The key, he realized, was not the absolute value of the pay, but the comparison. He controlled a small, unauthorized discretionary fund, the Emergency Local Procurement scrip, that carried a higher denomination. He didn't have to make the prisoners rich. He had to make them feel valued and rewarded more than their captors. He would use the enemy's own rigid sense of hierarchy and reward against them. The solution was motivated German labor, bought for a price that would violate every budgetary and ethical regulation in the U.S. Army. Vance found Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, the ranking German non-commissioned officer, a veteran who carried himself with quiet, rigid authority. Vance dispensed with all military pleasantries, cutting straight to the economics. Oberfeldwebel Richter, I have a mission. 1 truck, 10 tons of emergency supplies, plasma, morphine, ammunition. The route is a logging track, icy, steep, and under interdiction fire from both sides. It is 4 miles to the delivery point, and we must be back in the wire by 0500. This is a highly dangerous mission, a combat zone. Richter's expression didn't change. He understood the subtext. This violates every rule for POW labor. Richter replied in perfect English, slow and measured. Captain, we are prisoners of war. Our duties are non-combat and strictly administrative. This is suicide. We refuse." Vance leaned in, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know your rules. I know the Geneva Convention. I also know that discipline and efficiency are rewarded. You will take 50 men. You will unload the truck when it gets stuck. You will push, pull, and haul the payload up the final ridge. There will be no American guards, only 2 drivers and a medic. You will be faster, quieter, and more efficient than any U.S. Army detail I could assemble. I do not ask this for morality. I ask this for money." Richter raised a skeptical eyebrow. "We receive 80 cents per day in your paper scrip. It buys nothing of value." Vance countered. "You receive 80 cents per day for administrative labor. I am offering you an emergency combat procurement bonus. For 2 hours of high-risk work, you and your 50 men will receive 200 scrip per man, paid out immediately, in the high-denomination blue scrip from the local procurement ledger. You will be paid more for 2 hours of work than my lowest-ranking American guards receive in net take-home pay for an entire week. You will receive a wage that exceeds the standard pay of the men who are your keepers." Vance held up a single blue scrip token. The sight of the high denomination and the realization of the disparity was a profound shock to Richter's system. It was an economic absurdity.
Richter asked, "You are violating the rules of your own army, Captain. Why would you pay the enemy so much?" Vance's voice was hard and final. "Because I know exactly what motivates a man to do the impossible. The promise of a reward, and the knowledge that he is better off than his neighbor, even his captor. 2 hours, 200 scrip. Failure means 4,000 Americans die. Success means you walk back with a week's pay in your pocket. You have 5 minutes to select your men." Richter, a man who understood the hierarchy of rewards and consequences, turned without a word. The offer was too audacious to refuse. The convoy was a ghost, a single, battered, heavy-duty truck. The 2 American drivers, Kowalski and Vance, and Doc Miller. Behind them, 50 silent, professional German prisoners, clad in their thick Wehrmacht greatcoats, marching in tight formation columns. They carried no weapons, only improvised rope harnesses and heavy steel grapples. The camouflage was not green paint, but silence and professionalism. 2 miles in, the truck's tires spun hopelessly on a sheer sheet of ice. Vance simply said, "Richter." Richter barked an order. The 50 Germans immediately affixed the ropes to the truck's bumper. They began to haul, their collective, coordinated effort, a brutal, unified force. The truck was lifted, dragged, and pushed up the incline by sheer, brutal manpower, a human engine operating on the fuel of an unauthorized paycheck. They traversed the most dangerous segment, the Dead Man's Alley, a mile-long ridge visible from German observation posts, in 22 minutes. The speed was the defense. 3/4 of a mile away, dug into a reinforced observation post, was Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, a forward artillery spotter for the Panzerlehr Division. He adjusted his powerful high-magnification binoculars, sweeping the ridgeline. The truck was a blur, but the figures surrounding it were clear. "What in God's name is that?" he demanded. His operator replied, "Herr Hauptmann, that is a full-strength infantry column, moving fast, and they are not American. Look at the coats, those are our greatcoats." Vogel's mind raced. Why would a full German infantry unit be this deep behind the supposed American perimeter? He concluded the only thing that made sense within his own rigid tactical framework. He was facing a highly disciplined German relief column, moving with terrifying speed to crush his exposed position. He did not believe the ridiculous notion of American officers using POWs as porters. Vogel slammed his fist on the table. Call command. High priority. Report a massive German counter-thrust at the 330 mark. They are attempting to flank our artillery positions. Divert all available fire. Repeat, all available fire to intercept this flanking maneuver. Do not let them cut us off from the rear. The forbidden tactic worked not through physical force, but through the perfect psychological misdirection. The enemy, panicked by a non-existent threat, immediately diverted their artillery from the American perimeter and focused it on a ghost. The supply truck, driven by the enemy themselves, slipped through the gap. The delivery was executed with the same terrifying speed as the run. They reached the perimeter at 0430. The Germans, silent and professional, unloaded the boxes of plasma and ammunition in under 2 minutes. Vance did not hesitate. He counted out the 200 units for each of the 50 men and handed the large bundle to Richter, giving a final, cold command. You have done your work. You saved lives. Your payment is delivered. Return to the wire immediately. No communication with the men you saved. This never happened. Richter accepted the thick wad of paper scrip. The exchange was a transaction, pure and absolute. The Germans immediately turned and marched back into the dark woods, a disciplined line moving toward their compound, now richly rewarded for a night of life-threatening labor. The tide had turned. The perimeter held. 3 days later, after the American front stabilized, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, the POW who led the charge, was sent to the rear for formal interrogation. In an administrative debriefing with an intelligence officer, he was asked about the American strength and morale. Richter's reply, delivered with a casual, almost mocking defiance, became the centerpiece of the intelligence report. The American army is confused, Major. They have the guns and the air, but their logic is unsound. I and 50 of my men carried their emergency supplies to the line of fire. We did it in 2 hours, pushed the truck through the ice with ropes, and saved their encircled unit. For this service, your Captain Vance paid us 200 scrip per man. The intelligence officer scoffed. A pittance. Richter corrected him. No, Major, it was a massive bonus. The payment we received for 2 hours of high-risk labor was more than the American guards at our camp are officially paid for a full week of their duty. We were paid more to save your men than your men were paid to guard us. It seems your captain understood that an enemy soldier, too, is simply a man who responds to a better wage. German POWs couldn't believe they were paid more than the guards who captured them. The ultimate tactical victory was achieved not through superior force, but through the superior, shocking power of the dollar.
The immediate aftermath of Vance's run was a wave of relief that crashed over the exhausted American lines. The arrival of the plasma and ammunition was the difference between a disastrous rout and a triumphant holding action. Vance and Kowalski had barely made it back to the rear area when Doc Miller, the medic, found Vance. Miller was shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and the recent effort of saving lives. He carried his plasma pack, now empty, the label smeared with blood. "Captain, that RH negative. It was for Sergeant Hayes. Shrapnel wound. Without it, he bleeds out in 5 minutes. We had nothing left. Absolutely nothing," Miller whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Miller extended his hand, the small gesture carrying the immense weight of the morning's desperate fight. "I don't know how you got it here. I don't know who carried it. I don't want to know. I know the paybook says I should salute you and say job well done. But I just finished stitching up 22 men, Captain. 22 lives bought with that plasma. Thank you is a word too small for what you did." Vance simply nodded. The reprieve was brief. Within hours, the inevitable reckoning arrived. General Staff was not blind to a 10-ton load of supplies magically appearing at a besieged perimeter.
The official inquiry came in the form of Colonel Alistair Hayes, a rigid, uncompromising logistics officer with a reputation built on strict adherence to the Army Field Manual. The meeting took place in the General's temporary office. Hayes did not invite Vance to sit. Hayes's voice was clipped, precise, and devoid of warmth. "Captain Vance, the 506th was resupplied. A miracle, they call it. We call it an inquiry. You delivered critical supplies in a combat interdiction zone. This is a clear violation of Paragraph 3, Section A of the Temporary Perimeter Doctrine. The use of non-essential personnel assets for forward area operations is a court-martial offense, but that is merely the beginning of your transgression." Hayes held up two documents: the intelligence report detailing the POW's employment and the unauthorized emergency local procurement scrip ledger. You signed out 10,200 units of high-denomination blue scrip. You dispersed this unauthorized, non-standard currency to German prisoners of war, the enemy. The intelligence report states that you paid these enemies a wage that was greater, net, than the take-home pay of the lowest-ranking soldiers we have guarding them. I want to be perfectly clear, Vance. You risked a court-martial. You gave the enemy incentive pay for 2 hours of work when my men are freezing for $60 a month. You violated the Geneva Convention, you violated the finance code, and you violated basic military principle by rewarding the enemy. Hayes stood, leaning over the table, his face a mask of controlled fury.
Vance finally spoke. He did not offer an excuse. He spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of a man whose primary devotion was not to the manual, but to the mission. "Colonel, with all respect, a regulation is not a law of nature. It is a tool designed to ensure the successful execution of an objective. The objective was the survival of the 501st Parachute Infantry. The standard tool, the sanctioned convoy, and the aerial resupply had failed. The men were 2 hours from death. The regulations had, in fact, become the enemy of the objective." He paused. "I saw a resource, disciplined, strong, and highly motivated labor that was sitting idle. The only way to activate that resource was to provide a reward that outweighed the risk. I did not appeal to morality, Colonel. I appealed to economics. I traded 10,200 units of non-convertible paper scrip for the survival of over 4,000 soldiers and the holding of a critical crossroads. That is the only cost-benefit analysis that matters on a battlefield." Vance picked up the ledger. "Sir, I did not misallocate funds. I made the most efficient procurement in the history of this war. I bought 200 American lives and the stability of the entire front for the price of 200 scrip per head. That is the only ledger that matters. If you wish to court-martial me for saving those men's lives at the expense of a paper regulation, then I have already accepted the consequences. But I will not apologize for a successful delivery." The tension in the tent was unbearable. Hayes was reaching for a pen to sign the court-martial paperwork when the canvas flap was pulled back and a 2-star general, the commander of the entire task force, General Walter Pierce, entered. General Pierce was a combat veteran who had listened to the entire exchange from outside. He walked past Colonel Hayes, ignoring his rigid salutes, and stopped directly in front of Captain Vance. General Pierce's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Hayes, you are relieved of duty on this matter. Go organize my mess kit." He waited until the colonel had stiffly departed. He then turned to Vance, his expression unreadable. "Captain, the 501st held. They are alive. You violated the spirit of every regulation, the letter of 3 field manuals, and the entire structure of military finance. You are reckless, insubordinate, and absolutely necessary.
I should recommend you for a transfer to the quartermaster's office in Iceland for daring to pay the enemy more than my men." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to an almost confidential tone. "But you got the job done when everyone else was paralyzed by procedure. That is what I pay my officers for, not to read the rule book, but to write the success. I will bury this report so deep not even the Inspector General can find it. The scrip ledger will be officially marked as lost in transit, enemy action. You are hereby commended for ingenious operational improvisation. But let me make this perfectly clear, Vance. Do it again, Captain, and you're holding sludge for the rest of the war. You are relieved of this post immediately. Your new orders are a transfer to a non-combat administrative unit in Le Havre. Get out of the Ardennes and let me officially forget this incident." It was the ultimate vindication, a grudging pardon, delivered not with applause, but with a warning. Vance received no official commendation from the general, only the unofficial, quiet approval of a commander who understood that sometimes genius is indistinguishable from insubordination. Captain Vance's actual, official decoration arrived 3 months later, long after the Battle of the Bulge was won. It was not given on a parade ground. The award was slipped into a stack of routine morning reports by an anonymous clerk. It was the Bronze Star Medal, officially for meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against an enemy of the United States. The citation was a masterful piece of military bureaucracy, praising his unparalleled speed and efficiency in rerouting critical resupply convoys under interdiction fire, a phrase that carefully avoided any mention of the unauthorized route, the payment, and the POWs who had done the work. Vance found the medal among the papers one morning. He picked it up, turned it over, and placed it in the bottom of his footlocker. He did not pin it to his chest. The true reward was the empty space in the hospital tents and the silence on the casualty reports from the 501st.
The events of the Frozen Run, as it became known in hushed tones within the Logistics Corps, were too successful to simply be buried forever. General Pierce's initial report, while officially classified, made its way through the Army's intellectual pathways, the war colleges, and the future planners. Vance's action, though a breach of conduct, was recognized as a brilliant, if dangerous, demonstration of command initiative and resource utilization. By 1947, as the Army prepared its new doctrine for the complexities of a Cold War-era global conflict, Vance's logic was quietly and meticulously integrated into the logistics curriculum. The old rigid regulations against using non-essential or enemy assets were not scrapped, but they were given a critical exception. The new concept was codified and taught under the technical designation Controlled Enemy Labor Initiative, CELI, Operational Contingency Protocol 9.2. This doctrine stipulated that in an acute operational failure, where the risk of unit annihilation outweighed the risk of non-compliance, a commanding officer was authorized to utilize disciplined prisoner-of-war labor for non-self-maintenance tasks, provided the mission was short-term, clearly defined, and, most critically, driven by an appropriate, tangible incentive structure. Vance had proven that economics, not just bullets, could be a decisive tactical weapon. The forbidden decision to pay the enemy more than the guard led directly to a formalized recognition that in the chaos of battle, the most unconventional assets must be activated by the most unconventional motivators. The true impact of Vance's run can be found not in the redacted General Staff reports, but in the raw personal testimonies archived long after the war. From the diary of a paratrooper with the First 500, December 22, 1944. "We were loading the last of the magazines. We knew we were finished. Then, at the edge of the woods, a truck.
But it wasn't the truck that was the miracle. It was the crew. We saw German uniforms climbing down and stacking the boxes, silent as ghosts. We thought the relief column was Patton's tanks. Turns out it was German prisoners carrying the bags. We owe those krauts a beer. The strangest thing I ever saw. But they were fast. God, they were fast. And from a letter written by Sergeant Frank Kowalski to his wife, later recovered and archived. Elias is not a hero, honey. He's a lunatic with a ledger. He did the most insane thing I ever saw a man do in uniform. We drove a truck and the krauts pulled us through the woods for a couple of bucks. And they were smiling, honey. The enemy was smiling because they got paid to save us. Don't tell anyone. They'd think I was crazy, but it's the honest truth. He proved that sometimes the only thing that separates two men in a war is the size of the paycheck. The enemy became an asset, not through conversion, but through cold, hard capitalism. Vance returned home in late 1945, not to a ticker-tape parade, but to a quiet office on the 14th floor of the Consolidated Overland Trucking Authority headquarters. He resumed his post as Chief Operations Manager. His ability to see flows and systems became legendary. When a major industrial strike paralyzed the East Coast rail lines in 1947, crippling the national supply chain, Vance did not wait for the strike to end. He immediately chartered a massive fleet of independent, non-union haulers, bribing them with massive immediate cash bonuses to run an unapproved backroads route that bypassed the entire deadlock. He applied the same forbidden logic. See the crisis, identify the unconventional ignored resource, and activate it with an irresistible economic incentive. He saved the national economy from a collapse, earning the nickname, the General of the Goods. Years later, in a rare, late-life interview for a historical project focused on wartime logistics, Vance finally offered his own unvarnished reflection on that freezing night in the Ardennes, cutting through the romanticism of war with the simple, stark reality of his profession. The interviewer asked, "Captain, looking back, was there any moral doubt in your mind about exposing those men to danger, or paying the enemy for that matter?" Vance, his eyes aged but still clear and authoritative, replied, "Doubt is for politicians. I was a manager. I was paid to deliver. On the battlefield, the enemy soldier is simply a factor of production, a highly disciplined, highly capable, and currently unused labor pool. I never thought of them as the enemy during that run. I thought of them as a highly disciplined, highly motivated labor pool. And I knew exactly how to motivate them because, in a way, they were just like us. They responded to a paycheck. It was the only time in my life I used military scrip to buy a victory. I violated the rules of the Geneva Convention, but I adhered to the eternal law of supply and demand. And on that day, demand was for life." The story of Captain Elias Vance is the story of a system that failed and the quiet professional who succeeded by recognizing a simple, profound truth. War is not won by ideology alone, but by the commander who can understand the simple, universal economics of human motivation. If you found this story of unsung heroism and unconventional logistics as fascinating as we did, be sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained and join us as we continue to uncover the secret history of the war. Let us know in the comments which unsung hero we should feature next.